So we have a stack of documents on the desk today that just by any conventional logic, they really shouldn't belong together.
Not at all. They feel like they're from different planets.
Right. So on the one hand, over here, we've got this dense, very rigorously researched master's thesis. It's from 2016 by Rebecca McAlpine, and it details the life of an illegitimate daughter of King Charles II. It's a story of royalty, massive wealth, and the kind of interpersonal drama that, could literally topple governments.
And then on the other hand, we have this, well, it's rather dusty, crumbling volume from 1936. It's titled A History of Prostitution, From Antiquity to the Present Day.
And the author, George Riley Scott, he wasn't a historian or a sociologist or a psychologist or anything like that.
No, not even close. He was primarily and most famously a man who wrote guidebooks on how to breed chickens.
Chickens, that is the hook that just grabbed me immediately.
It's unbelievable, isn't it?
We are trying to bridge this, 300-year gap between the velvet-draped bedchambers of the 1660s Restoration Court and the rigid sort of pseudoscientific moralizing of a 1930s poultry expert.
Right.
It sounds like the setup for a bad joke, but the mission here is actually quite serious. We're looking at how society tries to categorize female sexuality, to put it in a box, label it good or bad.
Pure or fallen.
Exactly, and how actual elite women, specifically those with money and power, just completely obliterated those categories.
Precisely. We're contrasting the theory of female reputation as written by a man who's obsessed with biological categorization against the practice of female reputation.
As lived by a woman who broke every single rule in the book.
And yet somehow survived.
So let's start with the theorists. I think we have to. Let's look at George Riley Scott. When I was going through the background notes, I had to double check this was the same person.
I did too.
We have a bibliography that starts in 1919 with the Rhode Island Red. Then it moves to modern poultry keeping and includes a title that I wish this was in my own library, The Art of Faking Exhibition Poultry.
It is a fantastic title, isn't it? But it's also, I think, a real window into his mind.
How so?
Well, think about what showing poultry involves. It's all about phenotypes. It's about standards of perfection. You're looking for defects.
Okay, right.
You look for the comb that's flopped the wrong way or a feather pattern that signals impurity. And what do? You cull the bad ones and you breed the good ones to maintain the stock.
So his entire background is rooted in this idea of biological standardization. He looks at living things as commodities that need to be categorized based on their utility and how well they adhere to some visual standard.
That's it, exactly. And then, in the late 1920s, he pivots. He just stops writing about hens and starts writing about humans.
A pretty big leap.
A huge leap. But he chooses the most taboo, the most unregulated aspects of human behavior. So you get the truth about birth control, the history of corporal punishment, phallic worship, and, of course, the text we're looking at today, A History of Prostitution.
It feels like such a jarring shift, but if we follow your logic about the poultry, it's actually just a lateral move, isn't it?
I think so.
He's taking that same agricultural lens, this idea that you can judge a specimen by its adherence to a biological rule, and he's just applying it to women.
That is the critical insight. When Scott writes about prostitution, he isn't writing about sociology or economic desperation in a, compassionate sense. He's writing about biological determinism.
And the book itself, the 1936 edition, it presents itself as this grand scientific voice of reason.
Oh, completely. In fact, the 1940 edition actually carried a restricted sale warning on it. It was only sold to doctors, lawyers, sociologists, and criminologists.
Which right away creates this hierarchy of knowledge. It implies the content is somehow dangerous for the common man.
And certainly for the common woman.
Right. It elevates Scott to this kind of priestly class of keepers of the truth. But when you actually crack the book open, the science is, it's pretty telling.
It is very telling of his own biases. His central thesis is that prostitution is a byproduct of the institution of marital monogamy.
Which sounds academic on the surface.
It does. But his reasoning is that as long as men possess virility, and he uses that word as a sort of stand-in for an uncontrollable, almost hydraulic biological pressure, then prostitution is inevitable.
I want to drill down on that necessity argument. We found a review from a modern reader, a user named Curran and Folsom, who pointed out a specific page, 179.
Yes.
Scott basically argues that men require sexual access regardless of the state of their wives. So if the wife is pregnant or menstruating or just unwilling,
then the man must have an outlet.
you must.
It's a very convenient theory for a patriarchal society, isn't it?
Incredibly.
It frames the vice of prostitution not as a moral failing of men, but as a biological service industry, something that's required to protect the good women.
So he's essentially arguing that you need a class of fallen women to act as a kind of a heat sink for male lust.
That's a perfect way to put it. A heat sink. So that the pure breeding, the wives aren't, bothered and corrupted.
It's the Madonna whore complex, just codified into pseudoscience, and the tone he uses, it's so incredibly pompous.
Oh, the prose is impenetrable at times.
He uses 50 words when 5 would do, all to mask this very basic, very ugly idea that women are either wives or, well, toilets.
And there's a massive class component here that I think connects directly to our second source.
Yeah.
Scott makes a huge distinction between girls of gentle birth and the lower classes.
Right.
He seems to imply that for a working class woman, engaging in sex work is, well, maybe it's natural or expected, but for a woman of gentle birth, it's a tragedy, it's a fall.
Because in his chicken breeding worldview, a girl of gentle birth is a prize specimen. She's the exhibition poultry.
Exactly.
And if she engages in illicit sex, she is, to use his own phrase, faking the exhibition. She's flawed stock.
Precisely. He believes that reputation is fragile.
Yeah.
One crack and the value is just gone.
Which brings us to the perfect counter-argument. Because if George Riley Scott were to travel back in time to 1660 and meet Lady Anne Leonard,
his head would explode.
it really would. She was gentle birth to the absolute extreme. She was the king's daughter, and yet her life was nothing but cracks.
To understand Anne, we really have to understand the stage she walked onto. So we're leaving the 1930s now and dropping right into London in 1660. This is the Restoration.
Give us the sensory details here. What does the Restoration actually mean for the people living there? I think we take the term for granted.
Okay, so imagine living under what was basically a fundamentalist military dictatorship for over a decade. That was the protectorate under Oliver Cromwell.
Right, the Puritans.
The Puritans. Theaters were closed. Christmas was canceled. Literally illegal. It was a time of gray wool, moral surveillance, and this constant threat of dissent and decapitation.
Charles I had been executed after all.
He had. The psychological weight on the populace was just immense.
And then suddenly, the pressure valve just releases. Cromwell dies, the whole experiment fails, and they invite Charles II back from exile in France.
And Charles II is this. He's not a Puritan. He has spent his youth in the French court, which was sophisticated, it was sexually fluid, it was luxurious. So when he returns to London, the pendulum swings violently.
So it's not just a political restoration.
No, it's a cultural explosion.
Yeah.
Color comes back, theaters reopen, and for the first time ever, women are allowed to act on the English stage. And the morals of the court become, let's just say, flexible.
And at the absolute center of this flexibility is the institution of the royal mistress. And I think it's important to use that word institution, right? This wasn't just a secret affair.
No, and this is where the modern mind often stumbles. We think of a mistress as a secret. In the French tradition, which Charles brought over, there's the concept of the maîtresse en titre, the official mistress.
So it's a job title.
It was essentially a job description. She had apartments in Whitehall Palace, often better than the Queen's. She had political influence. She was a public figure.
And the woman who really defined this role in England was Barbara Palmer, the Duchess of Cleveland.
Lady Anne's mother.
Right.
And Barbara Palmer is a fascinating case study in what you might call predatory survival.
That's a strong term.
Well, she came from a royalist family that had been completely decimated by the Civil War. Her father died fighting for the king. So she was beautiful, she was aristocratic, but she was broke. Absolutely broke.
So for her, sexuality wasn't about romance, and it certainly wasn't about Scott's idea of falling. It was a capital strategy. It was a business decision.
She tried to marry a wealthy man, the Earl of Chesterfield, but he married someone else. So she married a man named Roger Palmer, a law student and diplomat in 1659. But almost immediately, she positions herself in the path of the returning king.
And Roger Palmer, the husband, he basically becomes the most famous...
Oh, the most famous cuckold in British history.
Yeah.
Absolutely. He does. But we have to look at the power dynamics here. Barbara becomes the king's favorite. She starts having children. And everyone, the court, the king, the husband, everyone knows these are the king's children.
But legally, they're his.
Legally, Roger Palmer is forced to accept them, at least initially. But the biology is public knowledge, an open secret.
And this is where our main subject, Lady Anne Leonard, enters the scene. Born February 25, 1661, she is the natural daughter of Charles II and Barbara Palmer.
Natural daughter is the polite term.
Right, the euphemism.
She was illegitimate. By the laws of the church, she was a bastard. By the laws of George Riley Scott's biology, she was the product of an illicit union. But
In reality, she was treated as a princess. Charles II acknowledged her. He gave her the rank of an earl's daughter.
it's a huge deal.
This just completely undermines Scott's whole thesis that illicit sex ruins a woman's social standing. Here is the literal product of illicit sex being raised in the palace.
Yeah, not just raised there. She's married off at the age of 13. In 1674, she marries Thomas Leonard, the 15th Baron Dacre, who was later created Earl of Sussex. This was a massive dynastic match. He was a lord of the bedchamber, a very powerful position.
And the king gave Anne a dowry of 20,000 pounds.
Yeah.
I want to just pause on that dowry. 20,000 pounds in the 1670s is, that's an astronomical sum of money.
It's tens of millions in today's purchasing power.
Yeah.
And just note where it comes from.
From the king.
It comes from the king. It is the wages of sin, if you want to look at it that way, paying for the legitimacy of the daughter. The money effectively washes away the stain of her birth.
So Anne is a teenage bride, she's a countess, she's wealthy, and she's legally secure. But she didn't just settle into a quiet life of, needlepoint.
No, she did not.
And this is where the story gets incredibly messy and where the specific accusations against her would have destroyed anyone else. We have to talk about the Duchess Mazarin.
This is the scandal of 1676. Anne is now 15 years old. A new woman arrives at court. Hortense Mancini, the Duchess Mazarin.
And who was she?
She was probably the most famous runaway wife in Europe at the time. She dressed in men's clothing. She was openly bisexual. She was brilliant, intellectual. And she came to England with one goal in mind.
To seduce the king.
To seduce the king.
Which she did. She displaced Barbara Palmer, Anne's mother. But the rumor mill, it didn't just focus on the king.
No. This is where it gets really complicated. The ambassadors, who were effectively the tabloids of the day, writing these detailed letters back to France and Venice, they started reporting that the 15-year-old Lady Anne was spending an awful lot of time with her father's new mistress.
And the accusation wasn't just friendship.
No, the accusation was explicitly of a same-sex relationship.
Okay, let's unpack the stakes here. In the 1670s, what is the legal or the social consequence of a woman having a same-sex affair? We know sodomy between men was a capital offense.
For women, it was legally ambiguous. The law didn't explicitly criminalize lesbianism in the same way, and that's largely because the patriarchal lawmakers couldn't quite conceive of how sex would work without a phallus.
So it wasn't illegal, technically.
Not the same way, but socially. It was considered monstrous. It was a subversion of the natural order. And for a married woman, a countess, to be involved with her own father's mistress.
It creates this just vortex of incestuous, adulterous panic.
Yes, and her husband, the Earl of Sussex, he clearly believed the rumors.
He must have been beside himself.
He was humiliated. He saw his control over his wife just evaporating in front of the entire court. His response was the nuclear option of the 17th century domestic sphere. He removed her from court.
So he takes her away from the city.
He packs her up and sends her to Hurstmonceux Castle in East Sussex.
Which is a beautiful castle. I've seen pictures of it, but in this context, it's a prison.
It's total isolation.
Yeah.
He is trying to break her connection to the, quote, pollution of the court, and specifically to Hortense Mancini. He thinks that if he can just lock her up in the countryside, she'll reset to being a dutiful wife.
But the reset doesn't happen. In fact, she breaks the next big rule. She runs away.
In 1677, she escapes Hurstmonceux. She gets on a ship and flees to Paris. And we have to remember, this is a criminal act. Under the law at the time, a wife was the property of her husband.
So leaving him was like stealing herself.
It was.
And she runs to her mother, Barbara Palmer, who's living in Paris at the time. You would think this would be a moment of, solidarity. Two bad women uniting against the world.
You'd think so, but it was far from it. This is where the human drama just completely overrides any kind of simple feminist narrative. Barbara Palmer is furious.
Why?
She's trying to maintain her own precarious position. She knows that Anne's financial security, and by extension the entire family's reputation, depends on that marriage to the Earl of Sussex. So Barbara actually sides with the husband. She tries to force Anne to go back.
Wow. And while this mother-daughter war is happening in Paris, Anne drops another bomb, the Ralph Montague affair.
Yes. Ralph Montague was the British ambassador to Paris. He was a notorious political operator, very slippery. And, crucially, he was Barbara Palmer's former lover.
You kidding? No. So Anne, having fled her husband and her rumored female lover, starts sleeping with the man who used to sleep with her own mother.
It is a profound, almost calculated betrayal.
Yeah.
It's almost. It's electrocomplex levels of psychology. Whether she was doing it to assert dominance over her mother, or maybe just because he was there and charming, who knows?
But the fallout was huge.
The fallout was nuclear. Barbara Palmer actually tried to have Anne locked in a convent, which was basically a religious prison, to stop the affair.
Okay, so if George Riley Scott were watching this, he would just be ticking every single box for degenerate.
Everyone.
Illegitimacy, check. Lesbianism, check. Desertion of her husband, check. Incestuous adultery, check. By his logic, Lady Anne should be destitute. She should be an outcast, completely ruined.
And yet, she wasn't. And this is the absolute core of McAlpine's thesis. Despite all the rumors, despite fleeing to Paris, despite the convent, despite everything, Lady Anne remained the Countess of Sussex. She eventually returned to England. She was received at court.
So this brings us to that concept of agency. It's a word that academics love, but what does it actually mean for Anne in this context? It doesn't mean she could do whatever she wanted without consequences, because she clearly suffered consequences.
Correct. Agency isn't freedom in the modern sense. It's the ability to negotiate. It's the ability to pull levers. A milkmaid who runs away from her husband has no levers. She starves. Lady Anne had the lever of her royal blood.
Right.
She had the lever of her massive marriage settlement. She had the lever of the king's affection. She could play the system against itself.
Speaking of playing the system, we have to dive into the legal dramas that really dominated the later years of these women. Because if the first half of their lives was all about sex, the second half was all about the law.
It really was.
And specifically, the bigamy scandal of 1706.
This story it's arguably more bizarre than anything in Scott's book on prostitution. It involves Barbara Palmer, Lady Anne's mother, later in her life. Her husband, Roger Palmer, finally dies in 1705. She's a widow, she's wealthy, and she's 64 years old.
Enter Robert Fielding. Handsome Fielding, as he was known.
Fielding was a complete narcissist and a fortune hunter. He was massively in debt. And in the early 18th century, if you were in debt, you didn't just declare bankruptcy, you went to Fleet Prison. It was a very real physical threat. He needed a liquidity event, and he needed it desperately.
And his strategy for a liquidity event was marriage.
Yes, because of the law of coverture. We should probably explain this because it's so alien to us now.
Please do.
Under coverture, when a woman married, her legal personality was essentially suspended. She became femme covert. Her property became her husband's property. Her money became his money to pay his debts.
So Fielding wasn't looking for a wife. He was looking for an ATM.
A human ATM,
Okay.
exactly. So he sets his sights on a wealthy widow named Anne Delow. He's never met her, but he knows she has a fortune of 60,000 pounds.
Wow.
He bribes her servants to get access to her house.
But the servants are running their own
The servants realize Fielding is a fool. So instead of introducing him to the real wealthy Anne Delow, they dress up a poor woman named Mary Wadsworth.
And Mary had nothing?
Mary had nothing. She was destitute. They present her to Fielding as the wealthy widow.
And he falls for it, just like that.
He is so blinded by greed, he doesn't check the credentials. He marries Mary Wadsworth in a secret ceremony on November 9, 1705. He thinks he's won the lottery.
But then the reality must have set in very quickly. He goes to get the money.
And there is no money.
Oh, no.
He realizes within weeks that he's been, in modern terms, catfished. But now he's in a legal bind. He is legally married to Mary Wadsworth. He can't divorce her just because she's poor, but he still needs money. So what does he do?
He commits a felony.
He commits a major felony. He decides to just ignore the first marriage and go for an even bigger target.
Barbara Palmer, for the Duchess of Cleveland.
Exactly. He seduces Barbara. She's lonely. She's aging. He's very charming. And on November 25, 1705, just 16 days after he marries Barbara.
So he is a bigamist.
He absolutely is. And for a few months, he tries to live this insane double life. He's abusing Barbara, he's taking her money, and he's trying to keep Mary quiet on the side. But the truth always comes out.
And it does in May 1706.
The whole fraud unravels.
This leads to the trial, which is titled Fielding versus the Earl of Sussex. Why is the Earl of Sussex Anne's husband involved in this?
Because Barbara, as a woman, still needed male representatives in court to handle the prosecution effectively. The Earl of Sussex, despite all the drama he'd had with Anne, steps in to help his mother-in-law destroy this man.
The trial must have been the scandal of the decade.
It was sensational. They brought Mary Wadsworth in to testify. They brought in the priest from the secret wedding. Fielding tried to argue that the first marriage was invalid because he was tricked, but the court ruled that a marriage is a marriage, regardless of motive. He was convicted of bigamy.
And what was the punishment for that?
Well, this is another one of those historical oddities. He claimed benefit of clergy, which was this archaic legal loophole that allowed first-time offenders to escape hanging if they could read a passage from the Bible.
Seriously?
Seriously. So he wasn't hanged. He was burnt in the hand with a hot iron and released. But his reputation was completely destroyed, and Barbara's marriage to him was annulled.
What strikes me at this whole story is that Barbara Palmer, the supposed fallen woman of Scott's theory, used the full force of the law to protect herself. She didn't just weep and accept her fate, she prosecuted him.
That is the key. These women were litigious. They were fighters.
Yeah.
And Lady Anne was exactly the same. Later in her life, there was the case of Chichester versus Lady Sussex in 1717.
And this one's about paternity, right? Going all the way back to her birth.
Yes. It was a complicated dispute over inheritance that hinged on whether Anne was truly Roger Palmer's daughter, which she was legally, or the king's daughter, which she was biologically.
It just shows that the open secret of her birth was still causing legal headaches 50 years later.
It's amazing that the legal system had to perform these kinds of gymnastics. Everyone knew she was the king's kid, but the law had to pretend she was Roger Palmer's kid for the sake of inheritance lines.
Unless the king herself stepped in with a specific decree.
And that ambiguity, that gap between the two realities, is where Anne lived her entire life. She existed in the space between the law, with a capital L which said monogamy, and the reality, which was royal power.
Which brings us right back to the comparison. We have George Riley Scott sitting in his library in the 1930s, surrounded by his books on torture and chickens.
It's quite the image.
And he's writing that prostitution is dreadful for ruling class women. He's trying to impose a rule of law on biology.
He is trying to create a tidy world, a world where bad behavior leads to bad outcomes. It's a moral fable, really, just masquerading as history.
But Lady Anne's life proves that bad behavior, adultery, desertion, sexual fluidity, it does not inevitably lead to a bad outcome if you have enough capital.
Symbolic capital is the academic term for it. And you should think of it like a get-out-of-jail-free card that never expires.
Right.
You could be bankrupt in actual cash. And Thomas Leonard, her husband, often was. But if you have the king's blood in your veins, you have a line of credit with society that a commoner simply does not.
So Scott's distinction between girls of gentle birth and working-class girls was actually correct, but completely not in the way he meant it.
How do you mean?
Well, he meant the gentle girls shouldn't do it because it would ruin them. But the reality is that the gentle girls could get away with it.
Precisely. The working-class prostitute in Scott's book is a victim of economic necessity. Lady Anne was a beneficiary of sexual privilege.
So let's look at the end of the line for these characters. Lady Anne eventually separates from her husband legally, is that right?
Yes, not a full divorce. That was nearly impossible back then. But a legal separation. A special act of Parliament, the East Sussex Estate Bill, was passed to manage the financial separation.
Why was that needed?
Thomas Leonard had squandered so much money on gambling and lawsuits that the entire estate had to be carved up by Parliament to protect it. Anne secured her portion. She lived independently.
She died in 1721 or 1722. She outlived her mother, she outlived her husband.
And she outlived the Stuart dynasty itself. The whole world she was born into was gone.
And she died a countess. She wasn't buried in a pauper's grave. She wasn't erased from history. She won in the sense that she survived entirely on her own terms.
She did.
So if we step back and look at the big picture, what we have are two sources that are just completely at odds. One says, biology is destiny and rules are rules.
And the other one says rules are for poor people.
And biology is a weapon. Scott thought women were victims of their biology, or at least victims of men's biology. Anne used her biology, her beauty, her bloodline as a tool, as a weapon, to carve out autonomy in a world that gave her none by default.
That's a great summary of it.
It makes me wonder about the George Riley Scotts of today.
How so?
Well, Scott wrote with such absolute confidence. He thought he was at the pinnacle of scientific understanding in 1936. He categorized women like he categorized chickens, and thought he had solved the puzzle of human sexuality. We look back at him now, and he just looks ridiculous. He looks like a bigot with a typewriter.
That's the danger of the deep dive, isn't it? It holds up a mirror.
Exactly. What are the things we believe today, the things we write in our scientific journals or say in our deep dives, that will look just as absurd to a historian in the year 2300?
That is a very humbling thought. We might be obsessing over, say, neurochemistry or evolutionary psychology in a way that future generations will just view as another form of phrenology or chicken breeding logic.
Yeah.
We might be creating categories for gender or mental health that are just as arbitrary and controlling as Scott's distinction between the gentle birth and the lower class.
We're just the poultry experts of the 21st century trying to fake our exhibition birds.
Hopefully with slightly better book titles.
We can only hope. But the core lesson from Lady Anne, I think, remains. History is rarely about the rules that were written on paper. The law books say one thing, the church sermons say another, but the reality is always, always about who could afford to break them.
And Lady Anne Leonard could certainly afford it.
It's been a fascinating clash of centuries. From the Rhode Island Red to the royal bedchamber, thank you for unpacking all of this with me.
It was a pleasure. A wild ride.
It really was. And to everyone listening, the next time you read a definitive history or a scientific truth about how people are supposed to behave, maybe check the author's background. They might just be a chicken farmer in disguise.